Good evening. Tonight we're entering the glittering, treacherous world of the Gilded Age, a time when money was power, appearances were everything, and widows, well, widows were dangerous. Because if you were a woman in the late 19th or early 20th century, your life was often mapped out for you. Marry well, smile politely, and try not to faint into the soup course at dinner. But if fate, or a conveniently timed accident, removed your husband from the picture, everything changed. Suddenly, you had money, you had property, and for the first time in your life, you had control. Of course, that control came with strings attached, wills with fine print, families circling like vultures, and a society that loved nothing more than building up a tragic widow, only to sneer when she stumbled. Tonight, we'll follow three of the most infamous widows of the Gilded Age. A teenage bride who became the Titanic's most famous survivor, a silver heiress who scrubbed her marble floors into blindness just to prove she belonged, and the most feared, frugal, and fabulously wealthy woman on Wall Street. These are the widows who ruled the Gilded Age, for better, for worse, and sometimes for laughs. In the Gilded Age, marriage was a contract. A woman gained status, yes, but she also gained chains. Her property was absorbed by her husband, her movements defined by etiquette, and her worth measured in ball gowns and airs. Divorce was scandalous, annulments complicated, and independence practically illegal. But widowhood, that was a different story. Widowhood was freedom wrapped in black lace. It turned women who were once ornamental into women who could write checks, make decisions, and even, shock of shocks, say no. It's no wonder the stereotype of the merry widow took hold. Some grieved, yes. Others discovered that life was infinitely easier when the most exhausting man in the household was no longer at the dinner table. It was one of the few socially acceptable ways for women to hold property, wield authority, and control vast fortunes. And make no mistake, the money was vast. Husbands who had spent their lives building empires in steel, shipping, railroads, or real estate often left behind staggering fortunes, sometimes billions in today's money. And when those fortunes fell into the hands of women, society didn't quite know whether to pity them or fear them. Of course, not every widow's story was the same. Some played by the rules, living quietly in respectability. Others threw parties that made Versailles look modest, and a few, like Hetty Green, simply dressed in black forever and terrified Wall Street into submission. So while men of the Gilded Age strutted around in top hats, convinced they were running the world, the truth was far more complicated. Many of the era's greatest dramas, scandals, and financial maneuvers were orchestrated by women who wore veils not just of mourning, but of strategy. And with that, let's begin with our first widow, a girl barely out of finishing school who found herself catapulted from scandal to sympathy, from the grandest yacht in Newport to the last lifeboat on the Titanic. Her name was Madeleine Astor. Madeleine Talmadge Force had the kind of background that would have satisfied any ordinary social climber. Born in 1893, she came from a wealthy New York family, attended the finest schools, and traveled through Europe often enough to accumulate more postcards than friends. By 1910, she was the sort of well-bred debutante destined to marry a banker's son and spend her afternoons in respectable boredom. But then she met Colonel John Jacob Astor IV. Astor was not just rich, he was Astor rich. His fortune, estimated between $87 and $150 million at the time, about $4 billion in today's currency, put him in the top 1% of the top 1%. He had yachts longer than most city blocks, and a mansion on Fifth Avenue so big it made neighbors resent him on principle. He also had a problem. Society didn't like him very much. Only 2 years earlier, Astor had divorced his wife, Ava Lowell Willing. Divorce in 1909 wasn't the tidy sign-here affair it is today. It was public scandal, complete with headlines, whispers, and invitations that suddenly stopped arriving. High society might tolerate mistresses, illegitimate children, and drunken brawls at the opera, but divorce, that was unforgivable. So when Astor, age 47, decided to remarry, he had to find someone not merely suitable, but scandal-proof. Instead, he found Madeleine, 18 years old, doe-eyed, and as unprepared for the avalanche of gossip as a deer is for hunting season. The press christened them Pauper and the Baby because subtlety was not part of journalism's skill set in 1911. Editorial cartoons depicted Astor as a cradle snatcher, while society matrons clutched their pearls so hard they left permanent dents. Even clergymen refused to officiate the wedding, forcing Astor to hunt for a minister willing to risk eternal damnation by association. The wedding, held on September 9, 1911, at Astor's Newport mansion, Beechwood, had all the trappings of grandeur: music, flowers, gowns, and a silent undercurrent of social disapproval. Rumors swirled that Madeleine's family had been persuaded, with a handsome payoff, to accept the match. Whether true or not, the scandal ensured that every canapé passed that night was seasoned with judgment. And yet, once the vows were exchanged, Madeleine was no longer just another debutante. She was Mrs. John Jacob Astor, the wife of one of the richest men in America, a teenager with access to unimaginable wealth and, unfortunately, unimaginable scrutiny. After the social storm of their wedding, Madeleine and Jack Astor embarked on what must have been the world's longest honeymoon. Europe, Egypt, Paris. They traveled in luxury that would make today's influencers green with envy. Photographs from the time show Madeleine with a shy smile, always standing just close enough to her towering husband to remind the public how absurd the age gap truly was. By early 1912, she was pregnant. The scandalized whispers had begun to fade, replaced by polite curiosity about the child who would inherit a slice of the Astor fortune. Madeleine was, at last, finding her footing in this uneasy marriage. Then came the Titanic. On April 10, 1912, the Astors boarded the ship at Cherbourg, France, accompanied by a small entourage of servants and a prized Airedale Terrier. The Titanic was the newest, grandest, most unsinkable vessel ever built, a perfect stage for America's richest newlyweds to flaunt themselves across the Atlantic. 4 days later, on April 14th, at 11:40 p.m., the iceberg struck. Amid the chaos, witnesses recalled Madeleine's calmness and Astor's dignity. The colonel escorted his young, pregnant wife to lifeboat number 4. When he asked to join her, citing her condition, he was denied. Chivalry in 1912 meant women and children first, and even billionaires were not exempt. Madeleine survived. Astor did not. His body was recovered a week later, carrying a gold watch, diamond rings, and a pocketbook thick with cash. When the Carpathia docked in New York on April 18th, Madeleine was transformed. No longer a scandalous bride clinging to an aging millionaire, she was now the tragic teenage widow of the Titanic. Society, which had scorned her just months before, suddenly wrapped her in sympathy. Newspapers depicted her as brave, dignified, even saintly, an almost miraculous rebranding accomplished by the cruelest twist of fate. In August 1912, she gave birth to John Jacob Astor VI, instantly securing her place in the family line. And yet, for all her newfound respectability, she was about to discover that her late husband had left her not only unimaginable wealth, but also unimaginable conditions. When Colonel John Jacob Astor IV's will was read, Madeleine must have felt as though she were opening a gift box that contained both diamonds and a hand grenade. On the surface, it was staggering generosity. She received $100,000 outright, about $3 million today, plus access to a $5 million trust fund, which translated into roughly $500,000 a year in income. She also had the right to use the Astor Fifth Avenue mansion, the Newport estate, Beechwood, a limousine, and enough horses to make her look like she was running a private cavalry. The newspapers dubbed her the richest teenager in America, wealthier than monarchs, richer than most robber barons, and not even old enough to vote. But Astor, like every self-respecting Gilded Age tycoon, had added fine print that could smother joy faster than an ill-fitted corset. If Madeleine remarried, she would forfeit it all. The income from the trust, the mansions, the cars, even the horses, gone. The purpose was clear: to keep Astor's fortune inside the bloodline and to discourage any fortune hunters from chasing the teenage widow. In other words, she could live in gilded comfort for the rest of her life, provided she agreed to remain forever alone. Dry humor aside, it was a masterclass in hypocrisy. Men of the era could remarry with impunity, sometimes before the funeral lilies had wilted. Widows, meanwhile, were expected to sit in marble mausoleums, writing thank you notes for sympathy bouquets until the end of time. For a while, Madeleine complied. She focused on raising her son, John Jacob Astor VI, affectionately nicknamed Jakey. Photographs show her elegant, solemn, and impossibly young, balancing grief and society's pity. Yet the clause in that will hung over her like a curse, reminding her that love came at a price, roughly $160 million in today's money. By 1916, Madeleine had decided that money wasn't everything. She was 22 years old, wealthy, admired, and unbearably lonely. Enter William Carl Dick, a banker and businessman. Against the advice of everyone who counted her inheritance more carefully than her happiness, Madeleine married him. Overnight, she lost the trust fund. The mansions reverted to the Astor family. The horses, the carriages, the Newport palaces, all stripped away, like Cinderella's pumpkin coach after midnight. She and William moved to a more modest estate on Long Island, where they lived a comparatively normal life by Astor standards. They had 2 sons, William Force Dick and John Henry Dick II. For a brief period, it seemed as though Madeleine had traded fortune for love and perhaps made peace with it. But fairy tales rarely last in the Gilded Age. The marriage soured. By 1933, they divorced, leaving Madeleine once again adrift. That same year, she made the kind of decision that ensures one's name is whispered, with both pity and disbelief. She married Enzo Fiamonte, an Italian prizefighter and sometime actor. If her first marriage was scandalous and her second ill-advised, this one was catastrophic. Fiamonte drained her finances, beat her, and at one point even sold a story to the tabloids titled "I Married the Titanic Widow." When she finally divorced him in 1938 for extreme cruelty, her fortune was in tatters. In her final years, Madeleine lived in a modest house in Palm Beach, far removed from the grandeur of Fifth Avenue. She reportedly hosted illegal card games just to cover expenses. Neighbors described her as a lonely, fragile figure, increasingly dependent on prescription medications. On March 27, 1940, she was found dead in her Palm Beach home. She was only 46. Rumors swirled about an overdose, though the official story was natural causes. Her estate amounted to less than $90,000 in liquid assets, a pitiful remnant of what had once been a fortune large enough to sustain dynasties. Meanwhile, her son, John Jacob Astor VI, fought bitterly with his half-brother Vincent over the Astor inheritance, ensuring that even in death, Madeleine's story remained entangled in the family's endless struggle for wealth. Thus ended the tale of the Titanic widow, a girl who went from scandal to sympathy, from palaces to poverty, all because of the merciless fine print in a Gilded Age will. If Madeleine's life proved that widowhood could be both liberating and lethal, our next widow shows what happens when you take grief and turn it into a weapon, and use it to dominate society itself. Her name was Theresa Fair Oelrichs, and her battlefield was a marble palace called Rosecliff. If Madeleine Astor's story was about money shackled by conditions, Theresa Fair Oelrichs' story was about money weaponized like a cannon. Born in 1871 in Virginia City, Nevada, Tessie was the daughter of James Graham Fair, one of the legendary Bonanza Kings who struck it rich in the Comstock Lode. Fair's fortune in silver mining ballooned to around $100 million, a cool $3.8 billion today. Unfortunately, his personality was less precious metal and more toxic waste. Known as Slippery Jim, he was mean, manipulative, and faithful to his mistresses, with a devotion he never gave his wife. Tessie's mother, Theresa Rooney Fair, finally had enough and divorced him in 1883. The settlement? $5 million. The largest divorce payout in American history at the time. Society may have frowned on divorce, but it could overlook quite a bit when your bank account was large enough to pay off half the judges in Newport. So Tessie and her sister Virginia Birdie Fair suddenly found themselves very rich, very young, and very determined. While most heiresses practiced piano scales and etiquette bows, Tessie studied society like a general studies maps. She understood that Newport and New York operated on a system of alliances and hierarchy, just as brutal as her father's mining camp. If she was going to rule, she needed a castle, and preferably a husband with the right bloodline. In 1889, she met Herman Oelrichs, a man whose family wasn't as rich as hers, but whose name opened doors. Their union was less a love story and more a merger, her new money for his old prestige. They married in San Francisco in 1890 in a ceremony notable for one glaring absence: her father, who wasn't invited. Instead, he sent a consolation prize, $1 million wedding gift, equivalent to about $35 million today. That little starter fund bought them a townhouse on East 57th Street in New York. But Tessie had no intention of living quietly. Within a year, she purchased 11 acres in Newport and hired architect Stanford White to build something audacious, Rosecliff. And when I say audacious, I mean it. Modelled after the Grand Trianon of Versailles, Rosecliff took 4 years and $2.5 million to complete, about $91 million in modern terms. With 30 rooms, a heart-shaped staircase, and a ballroom the size of a basketball court, it wasn't just a mansion. It was Tessie's declaration of war. For Tessie, Rosecliff wasn't a home. It was a weapon. The ballroom, 40 by 80 feet, was the largest private ballroom in America. Even unfinished, Tessie threw parties inside it, inviting hundreds of guests to dance among scaffolding and dust, as if to say, "Look, even my construction sites are more glamorous than your mansions." The message was clear. Old money gatekeepers like Madeleine Astor and the Vanderbilts could sneer all they wanted, but they couldn't ignore Theresa Fair Oelrichs. With Rosecliff gleaming on the Newport cliffs, she had forced her way into the conversation. She treated society like a ledger. Guests were catalogued in meticulous lists, each labelled as suitable or unsuitable. Her staff endured daily 9 a.m. inspections, where Tessie stormed through the marble halls like a general reviewing troop. She personally scrubbed the marble floors until the harsh chemicals cost her the sight in one eye. Servants were classified as good, bad, or rotten, and woe betide the footman who fell into the rotten category. Her fixation extended to herself as well. Tessie obsessed over her body with a fanaticism that would make modern Instagram influencers look relaxed. She starved herself, cinched her corsets tight, and exercised with military discipline. All this while hosting parties that set new records in extravagance, operas, ballets, magicians, even roller skating in the marble ballroom when guests were bored of waltzes. Meanwhile, her marriage to Herman Oelrichs devolved into open warfare. He found her exhausting. She found him irrelevant. By 1906, they were hosting reconciliation dinners that achieved everything except reconciliation. Herman fled to Europe while Tessie doubled down on Rosecliff and her obsessive command of society. But beneath the polished marble and white roses, cracks were forming. Tessie's ambition was limitless, but so were her fears. She became paranoid about money, cleanliness, and control. Rosecliff was less a palace now than a fortress against an enemy that only she could see. And then, in 1904, she decided to stage the ultimate spectacle, the Bal Blanc, a party so lavish that even Versailles would have rolled its eyes. By the early 1900s, Theresa Fair Oelrichs had secured her spot in the social triumvirate of the Gilded Age. Alongside Mamie Fish and Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, she ruled Newport like a general. Though Tessie was undoubtedly the most terrifying of, she treated society the way her father had treated silver mine, with ruthless efficiency. Invitations weren't gestures of kindness, they were strategic maneuvers. She kept detailed ledgers of who had attended, who had declined, and who had committed the ultimate crime of attending a rival's dinner. In Tessie's world, seating charts were as dangerous as battle maps, and a misplaced duchess could spell social annihilation. Her obsession with order bled into everything. Every morning at 9, she inspected Rosecliff personally, marching through the halls with the precision of a military commander. Staff trembled as she tapped on banisters, checked drapery seams, and when dissatisfied, grabbed a brush and scrubbed the marble floors herself. Years of harsh cleaning chemicals eventually damaged her eyesight so severely that she lost vision in one eye, a high price to pay for spotless marble. To her, servants were not employees, but chess pieces. They were ranked good, bad, or rotten, and the rotten ones vanished faster than hors d'oeuvres at a Vanderbilt ball. Guests were scrutinized too. If Tessie decided you were unworthy, you'd better enjoy your last glass of champagne at Rosecliff because you weren't getting another invitation. Even her own body wasn't exempt from her tyrannical standards. Tessie starved herself, corseted herself, and worked herself into a nervous energy that could have powered the entire Newport trolley line. Perfect was her only acceptable condition, and even then she suspected imperfection lurked around the corner. Her marriage, unsurprisingly, cracked under the strain. Herman Oelrichs, who had once seemed like the dignified old money half of their merger, grew weary of his wife's relentless obsessions. He retreated. She advanced. Their dinner table became a cold war zone, punctuated by frosty silence and failed reconciliation attempts. By 1906, Herman had left for Europe, leaving Tessie to preside alone over Rosecliff. But far from retreating, she escalated. If her husband wouldn't play the part of dignified host, She would double down on being the most commanding woman Newport had ever seen. And nothing displayed power better than a party so legendary, people would still be talking about it more than a century later. On a summer night in August 1904, Tessie unveiled her masterpiece, the Bal Blanc, the White Ball. Everything was white, the flowers, the draperies, the tablecloths. White swans floated in marble pools. White ships dotted the Newport harbour, glowing with lanterns. Even the guests themselves were transformed into powdered phantoms, dressed entirely in white, wigs included, powdered, until they looked like an 18th century painting brought to life. It took months of planning and enough money to fund a small war. When the guests entered Rosecliff's ballroom, they were stunned into silence by the vision. This wasn't a ball. It was Tessie's declaration of supremacy. Newport was hers. Society applauded, gossiped, and, most importantly, obeyed. The Bal Blanc entered the record books as one of the most extravagant parties of the Gilded Age, and Tessie basked in her triumph. But here's the problem with building your life around spectacle. You can't keep outdoing yourself forever. After the Bal Blanc, Tessie chased greater and greater displays, fairy tale themed dinners, opera performances, circus acts, even roller skating parties in her marble ballroom. Guests smiled, clapped, and whispered behind their fans that perhaps Mrs. Oelrichs was going just a little mad. The whispers weren't wrong. As the years passed, Tessie's obsessions deepened into paranoia. She demanded more scrubbing, more inspections, more control. She wasted away physically, consumed by starvation diets and corsets. She became convinced that money was slipping through her fingers, even as her fortune remained intact. By the 1920s, she was reportedly conversing with invisible dinner guests and hosting phantom parties for friends who hadn't been alive in decades. The death of her husband in 1906 had left her vulnerable, but it was the arrival of modernity that truly ended her. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913, followed by World War I, dismantled the foundations of Gilded Age excess. Suddenly, throwing swan-themed dinners seemed not just indulgent, but grotesque. Tessie didn't know how to adapt. She died in 1926, at the age of 55, alone in Rosecliff. Her son sold the mansion 15 years later for a paltry $21,000, less than the cost of one of her dinner parties. By the 1940s, Rosecliff stood abandoned, a marble ghost of Tessie's ambition. Today, it's owned by the Preservation Society of Newport County, a museum where tourists wander through the same halls she once scrubbed into blindness. They admire the heart-shaped staircase, the grand ballroom, and the ghostly silence. And if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear the faint strains of violins from that fabled night in 1904, when Theresa Fair Oelrichs stood at the height of her power, the drill sergeant of society, commanding an army in white. While Theresa Oelrichs was polishing marble in Newport, Henrietta Hetty Howland Robinson was polishing something else entirely, her investment strategy. Born in 1834 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Hetty came into the world swaddled not in lace, but in ledgers. Her family's fortune came from whaling, and her father, Edward Mott Robinson, expected a son. Instead, he got Hetty, and then promptly ignored her mother, Abby, who slid into depression. Hetty was raised largely by her stern Quaker grandfather and her formidable Aunt Sylvia. By the time most girls were reading fairy tales, Hetty was reading financial reports aloud to her grandfather. At age 6, she could tell you whether the whaling fleet had been profitable that season. At 8, she opened her first bank account. At 13, she was her father's bookkeeper. Forget dolls. Hetty's toys were bonds, ledgers, and shipping manifests. This financial immersion produced an unusual young woman. While other Quaker girls learned needlework, Hetty dissected government reports. By her 20s, she had rejected the trousseau most debutantes received, and instead asked for government bonds as her coming-out present. Her upbringing, stripped of frills and grounded in Quaker austerity, hardened her into one of the most disciplined minds of her generation. But discipline only gets you so far. Society expected Hetty to marry, soften, and fade politely into domesticity. Hetty, however, preferred compounding interest to candlelit dinners, and when she eventually inherited millions, she didn't spend it on gowns, jewels, or marble staircase. She spent it on leverage, and she never forgot a single penny. Still, her path to power wasn't without scandal, and it began, as many Gilded Age scandals did, with a will, a lawsuit, and a forged signature. In 1865, Hetty's beloved Aunt Sylvia died, leaving behind an estate worth $2 million. In her will, Sylvia generously provided for charities and cousins. Hetty was not satisfied. She produced an earlier will, allegedly written in 1862, which left Sylvia's entire fortune to her. Unfortunately for Hetty, the court smelled something fishy. The handwriting was suspicious, the witnesses unconvincing, and then came the nail in the coffin. A Harvard mathematician named Benjamin Pierce analyzed the signature with groundbreaking statistical methods and proved it was a forgery. The scandal was humiliating. The newspapers crucified, and Hetty was branded a forger, whether guilty or not. But humiliation has a funny effect on some people. Instead of retreating, Hetty grew harder, tougher, and more determined never to rely on anyone else for wealth again. 2 years later, in 1867, she married Edward Henry Green, a wealthy trader. But Hetty was not about to let a man ruin her fortune. She insisted on a prenuptial agreement, virtually unheard of at the time, that kept their finances completely separate. She would love Edward perhaps, but she would never let him touch her money. Edward soon discovered that life with Hetty was less about candlelight dinners and more about compound interest charts. They moved to London, where their children, Ned and Sylvia, were born. There, Hetty made one of her most brilliant plays. After the Civil War, US bonds were selling at a deep discount, their value uncertain. Hetty believed the US government would honor its debts in gold, not greenbacks. She bought aggressively, and when President Ulysses S. Grant guaranteed repayment in gold in 1869, she walked away with $1.25 million in profit. Her philosophy was simple: I buy when things are low, I keep them until they go up. A timeless motto, though less catchy than Warren Buffett's. Back in the United States in the 1870s, Hetty cemented her reputation as a Wall Street power play. She worked not from a mahogany office, but from a free desk at the Chemical National Bank, where she could watch the markets without paying rent. Her lunch was usually a simple meat pie carried in a metal box, eaten at her desk. She became known for her contrarian courage. When markets panicked, Hetty bought. When investors begged for loans, she lent, at reasonable rates too. Unlike the robber barons who gouged the desperate, Hetty had the almost radical idea that you could make money without cruelty. Of course, she still made a fortune, just with a little less blood on her. By the time of the Panic of 1873, she was scooping up railroad stocks and foreclosed properties at fire sale prices, building an empire in Chicago, St. Louis, and New York. She traveled constantly to inspect her holdings personally, saving money, naturally, by taking the cheapest trains and staying in the shabbiest boarding house. Yet even as her fortune grew, her marriage faltered. Edward Green couldn't resist speculating, and in 1884, he gambled disastrously on Louisville and Nashville Railroad stock. Worse, he used Hetty's securities as collateral without asking. When the banks froze her funds, Hetty sued to protect her fortune. Edward was publicly humiliated. Their marriage effectively ended, and he lived the rest of his life on an allowance from Hetty. By the 1890s, Hetty Green was both infamous and unstoppable. To her critics, she was the Witch of Wall Street, a miser in black Quaker dress who carried millions sewn into her petticoat. To her admirers, she was the first true female titan of finance, shrewd, disciplined, and utterly unwilling to play by society's. And while Theresa Oelrichs was throwing balls for swans, Hetty was busy quietly acquiring mortgages on half of Manhattan. By the 1870s, Hetty Green had evolved from a humiliated heiress into a financial predator who thrived when others panicked. If the stock market was a battlefield, Hetty was the general who showed up after the first round of cannon fire, calmly buying the land from the wounded. Her favorite hunting ground was a financial panic. When banks collapsed, investors wept, and fortunes evaporated overnight. Hetty arrived with bags of cash, literal bags, sometimes carried by hired guards. She would buy mortgages, railroads, and government bonds at rock-bottom prices, and then sit back, waiting for the inevitable rebound. It wasn't glamorous, but it was devastatingly effective. Unlike her rivals, men with sprawling offices, armies of clerks, and gold-tipped canes, Hetty preferred to work from a borrowed desk at the Chemical National Bank. She wore the same threadbare black Quaker dress every day, packed her own lunch, and heated her boarding house rooms with a single candle. Bankers who thought they could intimidate her quickly learned that appearances were her secret weapon. Underestimate her at your own peril. And she wasn't afraid to stand up to the giants. When railroad tycoon Collis P. Huntington tried to strong-arm her into backing a shady deal. Hetty allegedly placed a pistol on her desk and said, "Now, Mr. Huntington, let's discuss this like sensible people." He backed down. By the 1880s, her fortune had ballooned, and whispers of awe followed her as much as whispers of scorn. Newspapers painted her as both miserly and monstrous, calling her the richest woman in America, while caricaturing her as a witch with hooked nose and talons. Society snubbed her for her frugality, but Wall Street respected, even feared, her. Still, her relentless caution had a personal cost. Edward, her husband, grew resentful of living in her financial shadow. He wanted to speculate, to risk, to play the market like a gambler at Monte Carlo. Hetty wanted steady growth, airtight contracts, and cash reserves large enough to terrify an entire bank. The marriage began to crack under the strain, but Hetty didn't slow down. She was too busy acquiring real estate, collecting mortgages on churches, and buying up distressed railroad. The more people mocked her, the richer she became. In an age when men like Carnegie and Rockefeller wrote themselves into history with philanthropy, Hetty was writing herself in with sheer endurance. By the end of the decade, she wasn't just another investor. She was the market's conscience, opportunist, and bogeyman rolled into one. If a banker needed cash in a panic, he came crawling to Hetty Green. And if you saw her walking calmly into a bank with her black dress and battered lunch pail, you knew two things. Someone else's empire had just crumbled, and Hetty was about to make it hers. By the early 1900s, Hetty Green had become an urban legend as much as a financial figure. Children whispered about the Witch of Wall Street in her long black dress, said to haunt lower Manhattan with her ledger books sewn into her skirts. Journalists loved to exaggerate her eccentricities, that she refused to heat her rooms in winter, that she dined on scraps, that she let her son's leg rot because she wouldn't pay for a doctor. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in the messy middle. Hetty did live frugally, almost absurdly so for a woman worth hundreds of millions. She carried her lunch in a battered tin pail. She preferred $20 boarding houses to gilded hotels. And yes, she wore the same black dress for decades, partly from thrift, partly from Quaker simplicity. But the more scandalous stories, like letting her son's leg amputate because she refused to pay for treatment, were at best distortions, at worst, outright inventions. She did consult doctors, she did pay specialists, but she also distrusted medical bills almost as much as she distrusted lawyers. What was not exaggerated, however, was her genius for survival. During the Panic of 1907, while banks collapsed like dominoes, Hetty lent freely and at fair interest. She was, in essence, a one-woman Federal Reserve. By 1909, she held mortgages on everything from churches to cemeteries to entire blocks of Manhattan real estate. Still, even iron wills weaken. Hetty developed a painful hernia that she refused to treat for 20 years, fearing medical trickery. She grew more reclusive, moving constantly out of paranoia that lawyers or kidnappers were closing in. And yet, she never stopped checking her ledgers, never stopped calculating. Friends said she could recite her holdings down to the last bond, all by the flicker of a dim gaslight. She died on July 3rd, 1916, at the age of 81, reportedly after a heated argument over the price of skim milk. It was a suitably absurd ending for a woman who had once outsmarted every robber baron on Wall Street. At her death, her estate was valued between $100 million and $200 million, the equivalent of $3 to $6 billion today. The richest woman in the world, and perhaps the least glamorous. Her fortune passed equally to her children, Ned and Sylvia. Historians still debate her legacy. Was she a miser, a miserably misunderstood genius, or both? Perhaps the real irony is that while other Gilded Age fortunes were squandered on swan balls and marble staircases, Hetty's money endured. She outlived the ridicule, outlasted the bankers, and proved that you didn't need a ballroom to build an empire, just discipline, nerve, and maybe a suspiciously long candle. So what do we make of these widows who ruled the Gilded Age? Madeleine Astor, who became the Titanic's most famous survivor, only to lose her fortune to love and end her days in quiet obscurity. Theresa Fair Oelrichs, who built Rosecliff as her marble battlefield, commanding society with swans, powdered wigs, and sheer terror until paranoia consumed her. And Hetty Green, the Witch of Wall Street, who dressed like a pauper, hoarded like a miser, and still managed to become the richest woman in the world. Each widow wielded power in her own way, through sympathy, spectacle, or sheer stubbornness. They were loved, loathed, mocked and feared. But together, they showed that widowhood in the Gilded Age wasn't just about mourning, it was about transformation. Death freed them from their husband's control, but what they did with that freedom revealed just how fragile, absurd, and intoxicating power could be. In an era when women couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and were told to smile quietly in silk gowns, it was widowhood that offered the one loophole in the system, a loophole through which women slipped, sometimes to triumph, sometimes to tragedy, but always to remind the world that diamonds, marble, and banknotes were nothing compared to determination. So next time someone sighs over the romance of the Gilded Age, remember this: behind every gilded ballroom and every marble mansion was a widow, sometimes tragic, sometimes terrifying, who had learned the hard way that freedom came dressed in black. Good night,